Then the killer's mistake. Somehow he dropped the knife sheath, exactly like this one, a sheath with a snap.
Why leave the sheath behind? Why would that have happened?
Law enforcement later found a K-bar knife sheath placed next to Miss Mogan on her bed. The sheath was placed button side down and partially under Miss Mogan and the comforter.
And back in Idaho, the investigators finally caught a very big break. DNA from the knife sheath found at the crime scene had been analyzed by forensic genetic genealogists. A law enforcement source told us the genealogist suggested investigators focus on a particular family tree. NBC News reporter Stephanie Gosk.
Our source tells us they got a list, a small enough list, that they got a name.
A name in the immediate family of Bryan Kohberger. The cops went into hyperdrive. 2 days before Christmas, they used that DNA information to obtain a search warrant for Bryan's cell phone records and found a treasure trove. Records that revealed those repeated comings and goings of Bryan Kohberger's phone to King Road, including on the night of the murders. And records showing Kohberger owned a 2015 white Hyundai Elantra, just like the one seen in that gas station surveillance footage a mile from the crime scene around the time of the murders. Together with the DNA, the police finally had their suspect.
If they had not used that forensic genealogy, they might never have identified him. His name gave them the cell phone number, and it wasn't until they got the cell phone number that they could put the cell phone and the car in the neighborhood at the same time.
The noose was tightening.
In Ann Taylor's declaration in support of the third motion to compel, she testifies that despite requesting all DNA profiles, including 3 unidentified male profiles that were developed during the investigation, the state has not supplied this information. The only information regarding DNA that the state has given to the defense is for the knife sheath only, but the state refuses to provide any information related to genealogical testing. The defense contends that this discovery is necessary to the preparation of Mr. Kohberger's defense. The state acknowledges it used genetic genealogy testing in this case, but claims it does not have to produce the records in the specific request for discovery. The defense disagrees. Defense counsel has learned through consultation with experts and sources referenced below that the use of genetic genealogy databases does not necessarily lead to a single individual as a potential suspect, and that reports of these searches often reference multiple individuals for further investigation and DNA testing. In fact, the state acknowledges such in its motion for protective order when it acknowledges, quote, hundreds of relatives, end quote, page 5 on the motion for protection order. The testing conducted by a private lab is completely different in nature than the testing done by forensic labs. Genetic genealogy labs do not generate a profile in the same way that forensic labs do, and there cannot be a direct comparison between the data obtained in this case by the Idaho State Forensic Crime Lab and the private lab. The tests used by the private labs are either SNP, single nucleotide polymorphisms, or genome sequencing. These tests are similar methods used by commercial services such as 23andMe and Ancestry.com. Based upon information from experts in the field, I have learned that once a genetic genealogy profile is created and the testing by the private lab is completed, the profile is uploaded to a database that contains similar data from other individuals. Once the genetic genealogy profile is uploaded, the profile is compared within that database and relatives are identified. It is my understanding that once possible relatives have been identified, their identities are used to construct a family tree to identify possible suspects using public records and, in some instances, contacting individuals for further family information. This process leads to a pool of individuals rather than one specific individual. The possibility of other relatives who might be similar to Mr. Kohberger is extremely important to the defense in this case. The processes used in this method of identification may be extremely important to Mr. Kohberger's defense. The timing and steps utilized are extremely important to Mr. Kohberger's case, investigation, and defense. I am aware of specific news reports in this case regarding Mr. Kohberger's DNA, as published by the New York Times on June 11, 2023, that, quote, FBI personnel worked with the profile that Othram had produced, spending days building out a family tree that began with distant relatives, end quote. The New York Times sources have more information than the state has disclosed to the defense. The New York Times article generated intense media coverage and interest. In addition, Mr. Kohberger's defense team has discussed the use of statistics in this type of case with experts who informed me that the manner of identifying Mr. Kohberger via this type of search may have significant impacts on the statistical analysis of the CODIS profile generated by the Idaho State Police Lab. Without access to the actual genetic genealogy search methods and results, it is impossible for qualified experts to address these issues. Counsel for Mr. Kohberger notes that the state utilized a statistical analysis number to claim a high likelihood of a match between the DNA on the sheath and that of Mr. Kohberger. The state, by its own admission, has taken a number of steps to identify Mr. Kohberger as a match. The statistical probability is not an absolute. The size of comparison sample and the nature of the search are important to ascertain conclusion bias. Mr. Kohberger has a right to effective assistance of counsel. He has a right to confront evidence. Counsel must undertake a thorough investigation of all parts of the case the state brings against Mr. Kohberger. As such, the genetic genealogy investigation and process is necessary for the defense team to do its job.
Turns our attention to Moscow, Idaho. It's here where genetic genealogy may have been key to solving an active case. It's been widely reported that authorities used public DNA databases to zero in on their prime suspect.
Well, I think what's interesting about that particular case is that genetic genealogy is not mentioned anywhere in the court records or affidavits at this point.
He's watching how genetic genealogy will play out in the courtroom.
Moving forward, does that change how it's practiced, or does that set some standards for this? Because at the moment, it's done in a variety of different ways across the country. There are no standards of practice.
If they had not used that forensic genealogy, they might never have identified him.
Like I said, we take the totality of the situation. We try to make the best bit of information we can with everything that comes in, and then we make our decision off of that. So, well, I'm not going to go into what they shared that night. Obviously, that's part of our investigation. That's part of the information that we're trying to build our complete story with. So we're looking at all resources. We got, like I said, the Federal Bureau of Investigation helping us. We got our detectives, our forensic detectives looking into that. We're trying to pull this whole picture. We're looking at everything that we can look at, social media, etc. Like I've said, we do have a suspect out somewhere, and we are looking for that individual to solve this.